The collapse never begins with gunfire. It begins with silence, the silence of a system that no longer responds. Banks freeze, ATMs stop, supply chains stall, the flow of calories, medicine, fuel, and data fractures. Humans sense the rupture before the institutions admit it. Trust evaporates long before the infrastructure fails. Once trust dies, money dies with it. Every precursor to a post-apocalyptic economy follows the same trajectory. The population stops believing symbolic value can protect biological survival. A printed note cannot generate heat. A metal coin cannot disinfect a wound. A digital balance cannot purify water. When the organism is threatened, the brain defaults to primal accounting. What keeps me alive in the next 12 hours? In this phase, gold and silver lose their sheen. Not because they lack intrinsic qualities, but because they do not solve immediate kill mechanisms. Hunger kills in days. Infection kills in hours. Cold kills overnight. When the threat becomes physical, humans trade only for what interrupts death. Everything else becomes background noise. Crowd psychology amplifies the shift. One person hoards food, 10 people hoard water, 1,000 people storm remaining supply routes. Currency collapses not from lack of backing, but from lack of belief. When no one accepts the symbol becomes meaningless. And once the symbol dies, the only remaining metric is utility measured in biological minutes. This is the threshold. After it, the rules of civilization no longer apply. Value is rewritten by physics, not economics. The individual who understands this transition early survives. The individual who clings to the old system becomes another statistic. The death of symbolic value begins the moment survival separates from abstraction. In a functioning society, money works because systems translate symbols into real goods. A store converts currency into calories. A hospital converts payments into medical intervention. A fuel depot converts digits on a screen into mobility. But when the system fractures, the conversion chain breaks. What remains is a symbol without a mechanism. Gold, silver, paper notes, cryptocurrency, all collapse for the same reason. They cannot be metabolized, burned, absorbed, or applied to a wound in a world where logistics no longer exists. In every historical collapse, the pattern repeats with mathematical precision. In Sarajevo, gold bought nothing during active siege days, while a cigarette or a can of meat could dictate the outcome of a negotiation. In Venezuela, hyperinflation did not make people shift to gold. They shifted to flour, rice, antibiotics, gasoline. In Argentina's 2001 crisis, precious metals held long-term store of value but had near-zero velocity in the chaotic phase, because no one risked life for a transaction that did not increase their survival window. In Russia's 1998 collapse, it wasn't silver coins in circulation. It was sugar, alcohol, and batteries. The evidence is consistent across wars, famines, blackouts, and political breakdowns. Symbolic value requires stability, enforcement, and predictable exchange networks. Remove any one of these, and the symbol dies instantly. Gold and silver fail in SHTF, not because they lose long-term worth, but because they do not solve short-term mortality. They cannot be eaten. They cannot disinfect a wound. They cannot boil infected water. They cannot generate heat in sub-zero temperatures. They cannot stop a human threat in the dark. They are excellent stores of value in a functioning marketplace, but they are catastrophic failures in a world without one. This is the symbolic severance point, where humans abandon abstraction and revert to biological valuation. The measure of worth shifts from purchasing power to survival extension. A single calorie-rich food item provides measurable hours of life. A working lighter provides warmth and the ability to process food. A bandage stops bleeding and prevents infection. A battery powers communication, light, and navigation. Each of these extends survival time. Metals do not. Psychology accelerates the decline. During collapse, humans default to risk-minimized decision-making. Trading for gold requires the belief that gold will later be exchangeable for life-sustaining resources. But collapse destroys future certainty. With no assurance of rescue, law, or return to normalcy, the future becomes irrelevant. People trade only for the present. In that environment, gold and silver offer no tactical advantage. They cannot provide existential leverage. They cannot tilt a negotiation. They cannot alter the physical threats stalking every hour of the collapse. As scarcity intensifies, symbolic value becomes dangerous. Carrying metals attracts predators. Displaying wealth marks you as a target. The more valuable an item is in normal society, the more suicidal it becomes to carry openly during systemic breakdown. Survivors abandon metals not only because they are useless, but because they increase mortality risk. What remains valuable must either be consumable, concealable, or weaponizable. Gold and silver are none of these. At the deepest level, the death of symbolic value reveals a truth civilizations prefer to ignore. Economies exist only while biological needs are met. When the biological layer fractures, the economic layer collapses instantly. Collapse does not test the strength of currency. It tests the strength of logistics. And once logistics die, all symbolic forms of money revert to their true physical identity. Inert materials with no immediate use. The world after that point operates on a new logic. Value is determined by scarcity, risk, and immediate survival impact. The symbols of the old world lose authority, and the currencies of the new world emerge from necessity, not tradition. Calories become the first and most dominant currency the moment the grid collapses. Every organism on the planet runs on energy, and humans are no exception. When supply chains fail, the body becomes the final bank account, and every trade is measured against one metric. How many hours of life does this provide? Food, water, and burnable fuel form a single category because they all convert directly into biological or thermal survival. In SHTF, this is the only value that matters. During sieges, famines, and long-term blackouts, calorie flow becomes the backbone of every negotiation. A can of meat carries more leverage than gold bars. A bag of rice can open doors, buy routes, or dissolve hostility. A single water purification tablet can determine whether someone travels or dies. Calories dictate mobility, endurance, and cognitive clarity. A well-fed survivor can scout, defend, build, and move. A starving one becomes non-functional, irrational, and eventually expendable. This truth governs every collapse zone ever recorded. The structure of calorie currency is brutally simple. High-density food like peanut butter, canned fish, beans, and energy bars sits at the top of the hierarchy. Shelf-stable items with long storage life become strategic assets. Anything that spoils quickly becomes worthless unless consumed immediately or traded in panic. Water is the exception. Even when abundant in the environment, clean water remains rare because filtration collapses with infrastructure. Survivors trade aggressively for purification tools, chlorine tabs, filters, and fuel for boiling. Water is not just a resource, it is a time extension mechanism. Fuel joins food in this economy because heat equals survival. Propane, alcohol, solid fuel tablets, even candles become trade items with predictable value. A stove that works without electricity becomes a negotiation tool. The ability to generate fire is the ability to sterilize. cook, defend, and stay alive in the dark. Fire is control. In this world, calories establish social power. A person with food becomes a node in the survival network. People approach with caution, respect, or fear, depending on scarcity. Deals are made not with long-term trust, but with the immediate need to sustain the next sunrise. Calories buy compliance, alliances, silence, and safe passage. Nothing matches their primacy. Without calories, every other currency becomes irrelevant. With calories, the survivor becomes operational. Medicine becomes currency the moment the first injury goes untreated. In a functioning world, painkillers, antibiotics, antiseptics, and bandages are background items, cheap, abundant, taken for granted. But when hospitals shut down, pharmacies empty, and infection becomes a mathematical certainty, medicine transforms into a strategic asset more valuable than any metal humanity has ever mined. In collapse, nothing equals the power to stop pain, stop bleeding, or stop infection. Painkillers become the first to vanish. Even low-grade tablets hold transactional weight because pain destroys mobility, clarity, and morale. A person unable to move cannot defend, gather, or flee. A single dose that restores function has a measurable survival impact. Antibiotics sit even higher. In every war and disaster, infection kills more people than bullets. A minor wound becomes fatal when no medical system exists to intervene. Capsules of amoxicillin or doxycycline become equivalent to hours, days, or weeks of life. They are not traded casually. They are traded with fear, calculation, and leverage. Disinfectants like iodine, chlorhexidine, and alcohol become negotiation catalysts. A bottle of antiseptic can prevent a wound from turning into a death sentence. Gauze, tourniquets, and clotting agents form the next layer. They are not symbolic tools, they are mechanical devices that directly interrupt the kill chain. A bandage that stops bleeding is more valuable than any coin ever minted. Medicine's power does not end with physical function. It shapes social dynamics. A survivor capable of treating injuries becomes a protected resource instead of a target. A small medical cache grants influence. People trade information, labor, food, or protection for a single treatment. In field conditions, health equals operational capability. A wounded group becomes prey. A healthy group becomes a negotiating force. Unlike calories, medicine has no substitute. It cannot be improvised reliably. It cannot be replicated without infrastructure. It decays, runs out, and forces hard decisions. This scarcity drives its value far beyond material worth. Trade stops being economic and becomes triage. In every collapse ever documented, medicine becomes the currency that defines who continues operating and who does not. Energy becomes the hidden backbone of every post-collapse economy. When the grid fails, the world fractures into pockets of darkness, and in that darkness, energy becomes power in the most literal sense. Every device that once depended on invisible infrastructure now demands a physical source. Batteries, gas canisters, solar chargers, inverters, lighters, fuel tablets, and crank-powered tools turn into currency because they restore capability. Capability is survival. The first shift occurs within hours of a blackout. Light disappears, refrigeration dies, communication ceases, and navigation becomes primitive. People scramble for flashlights, radios, and anything that can produce heat or signal. A single set of AA batteries becomes a bargaining tool. A functioning lighter becomes a negotiation advantage. The ability to ignite fire transforms from a convenience into a life-preserving mechanism. Fire purifies water, cooks food, signals position, and deters predators, human or otherwise. As the collapse deepens, gas becomes the high-value standard. Propane, butane, and alcohol stoves allow families to survive without electricity. Mobility depends on fuel, and while liquid fuels degrade, compressed gases remain stable for years. A small gas cylinder can buy food, shelter, or medical treatment. Energy density is what matters, not form. Survivors trade based on what produces the most functional output with the least risk. Portable solar chargers enter the economy as resilient assets. They do not rely on supply chains, and they provide steady trickles of power that can run radios, GPS units, headlamps, and critical tools. The survivor who can generate power, no matter how slowly, possesses leverage others cannot match. In every recorded conflict zone where grid failure became long-term, microgeneration was equivalent to status and security. The person who can keep devices alive becomes a node in the information and communication network, and networks form power structures. Energy also shapes the battlefield. Night vision, thermal devices, and optics require batteries. The side capable of operating in low light dominates movement and ambush. A handful of CR123 lithium cells can tilt the outcome of a territorial dispute. Even small drone batteries become currency because aerial reconnaissance provides overwhelming advantage when law has collapsed. Energy is not traded as an object, it is traded as tactical superiority. In the absence of infrastructure, energy becomes non-negotiable. Without it, water cannot be purified efficiently, tools cannot run, communication cannot be maintained, and night becomes lethal. With it, a survivor regains control over their environment. This is why energy remains a top-tier currency. It multiplies capability, and capability determines who dictates terms and who obeys them. Information becomes currency the moment uncertainty becomes lethal. In a stable world, data is noise, ignored, diluted, buried under excess. But when systems collapse, information transforms from background chatter into a survival determinant. Knowledge of routes, risks, resources, and human behavior becomes more valuable than any physical asset. In SHTF, the survivor who knows more lives longer. The survivor who knows nothing becomes a target. The first form of information, situational awareness. Radio signals, local broadcasts, scanned frequencies, and handwritten notes are often the only channels left when digital infrastructure dies. A working radio becomes a negotiation tool equal to medicine. Updates on troop movement, checkpoints, raider activity, disease outbreaks, or supply drops can shift an entire group's fate. A single piece of correct information can prevent ambush, starvation, or infection. People trade food, fuel, or labor for intel because intel removes blind movement, and blind movement kills. Maps, digital or paper, gain a new dimension of value. When GPS drops or satellites fail, only those with real maps and the skills to read them maintain mobility. Mobility is survival. Knowing which bridges have collapsed, which roads are blocked, which neighborhoods burned, and which wells remain functional becomes currency. Every collapse zone produces small clusters of information gatekeepers. Individuals or groups who trade safe paths, hidden routes, entry points, and extraction windows. Their value comes not from force, but foresight. The next layer is operational knowledge. Skills that were hobbies during peacetime become decisive assets. The ability to repair radios, build antennas, identify potable water, treat wounds, preserve food, reload ammunition, navigate with stars, or conceal thermal signatures becomes a form of currency because it solves problems no item can replace. In every historical collapse, the technician, the medic, the navigator, and the communicator survive not by stockpiling gear, but by understanding systems well enough to compensate when gear fails. Information also governs social power. Groups with better intel dominate negotiations. They choose when to engage, when to retreat, when to trade, and when to vanish. They avoid threats before threats materialize. They intercept opportunities others never notice. The collapse becomes a chessboard, and information becomes the only piece with unlimited movement. The group that controls flow of information shapes the battlefield without firing a shot. In long-term breakdowns, misinformation becomes a weapon. False signals, decoy routes, staged broadcasts, and planted rumors manipulate behavior. Survivors who lack verification channels fall into traps designed by those who understand information's leverage. Knowledge is not merely currency. It is a weapon system. It decides who walks into danger and who walks around it. When law collapses, the one who sees the farthest survives the longest. Information becomes the only currency that cannot be stolen, burned, or looted. Once internalized, it becomes part of the survivor's operational identity. And because it is invisible, portable, and infinitely applicable, it remains one of the strongest currencies in any post-collapse economy. Safety becomes the final and most feared currency in a post-apocalyptic economy, because it is not traded as an item, but as the power to determine who lives and who does not. When law dissolves and violence becomes a predictable variable instead of an exception, safety transitions from abstract security to a quantifiable commodity. Weapons, ammunition, protected territory, and the capacity to enforce boundaries become the operational equivalent of a functioning bank. In collapse, safety is wealth. Weapons are the first layer. A firearm is not a symbol. It is a mechanical device that controls space. Ammunition becomes its fuel. When supply chains die, every bullet gains measurable value because each one can stop a threat, deter an approach, or secure a supply run. Ammunition becomes both a tool and a trade item, but its value is never stable. It fluctuates with danger levels. The more hostile the environment, the more each round becomes worth. A community starved of ammo becomes prey. A group with surplus controls roads, resources, and negotiations. The next layer is protection itself, active security provided by trained individuals or coordinated groups. During real collapses, security for food becomes a common exchange. People with defensive skills, scouts, guards, former military, technically competent civilians, trade time and risk for calories, medicine, or shelter. Their labor becomes currency because they absorb danger others cannot handle. In many siege zones, armed escorts for water collection or scavenging runs became the dominant trade mechanism. Safety shifts from an abstract right to an earned, purchased, or negotiated resource. Territory becomes the third layer. A defensible structure, a basement, rooftop, warehouse, or rural shelter, acquires enormous value. Walls that stop bullets, angles that expose approaching threats, and choke points that reduce risk are worth more than gold ever was. Survivors trade access, shelter time, or safe storage slots inside these strong points. The physical location becomes an asset whose worth is defined entirely by how well it reduces mortality. The final layer is reputation. In a world without law, credibility becomes a survival tool. Groups known to protect their own and honor trade deals maintain stable alliances. Groups known for betrayal or ambush generate fear-based compliance, but suffer long-term isolation. Reputation itself becomes currency because it determines who can negotiate without conflict and who must fight for every resource. Safety is not just the absence of danger. It is the presence of predictable behavior. In every collapse ever documented, safety becomes the ultimate currency because it multiplies the value of every other resource. Food cannot be stored without safety. Medicine cannot be applied without safety. Energy cannot be used without safety. Information cannot be acted on without safety. Every other currency depends on it. When danger becomes constant, safety becomes priceless. In the end, safety is not an object, it is a force. It shapes trade routes, alliances, territorial lines, and the lifespan of every survivor who walks the ruins. Those who can create safety gain power. Those who cannot are forced to buy it at any price. The rule of exchange in a collapsed world does not resemble economics. It resembles physics. Every trade becomes a transfer of risk, a conversion of danger into opportunity, a calculation measured not in profit but in survivability. Without law, currency stops being symbolic and becomes tactical. What you trade, how you trade, when you trade, and with whom you trade determines whether you see the next day. Collapse strips away the illusions of markets and reveals the underlying mechanism. Value equals the amount of mortality reduced. The first law of post-collapse exchange is immediate utility. No one trades for future benefit because the future is no longer guaranteed. Every transaction is judged by what it provides in the next hours, not the next months. This destroys speculation. It destroys long-term planning. It brings all value back to the present. When hunger, infection, and violence dominate the horizon, a can of food has more leverage than gold because it extends life in a measurable way. A bottle of antibiotics interrupts a fatal outcome. A handful of ammo reduces the odds of being overrun. The conversion is simple. How many minutes, hours, or days of survival does this item buy? That number becomes its price. The second law is risk pricing. In a lawless environment, items with higher acquisition risk carry disproportionately higher trade value. If retrieving water requires crossing contested ground, water becomes worth more than its intrinsic use. If collecting firewood demands movement through exposed terrain, fuel becomes a high-tier commodity. If medicine requires raiding a looted clinic, the danger embedded in the act transfers into the item itself. This is why certain goods skyrocket in value while others stagnate. Danger becomes part of the currency. The third law is scarcity amplification. When supply chains collapse, items with no manufacturing replacements gain exponential value. Ammunition, antibiotics, fuel canisters, lithium batteries, mechanical parts. Once they are gone, they are gone. Survivors do not trade these lightly. They calculate whether the loss of the item reduces their long-term survivability more than the short-term gain increases it. This produces a brutal equation where many trades simply do not happen because they weaken the trader too much. The fourth law is reputation economics. In collapse, trust is not moral, it is operational. A trader who violates deals becomes radioactive. No group cooperates. No one approaches. They must use force for every acquisition, which burns resources, draws attention, and accelerates death. A trader known for fairness, consistency, and controlled behavior becomes a preferred contact. Reputation becomes a buffer that reduces risk and increases trade volume. The reliable survive longer because cooperation is cheaper than continuous conflict. The fifth law is enforcement dominance. Every trade exists under the shadow of violence. Without law, the ability to enforce agreements becomes part of the value calculation. Groups with security, numbers, or firepower can stabilize exchange through deterrence. Groups without it suffer exploitation. This is why armed enclaves, fortified compounds, and coordinated units often become trade hubs in post-collapse zones. Their ability to suppress chaos makes them the closest thing to a functioning market. The sixth law is information leverage. Knowledge of supply routes, raider activity, safe zones, or hidden caches transforms basic goods into superior bargaining tools. A small resource paired with accurate intel becomes more valuable than a larger resource paired with ignorance. The person who knows where not to die controls negotiations. When these laws combine, the result is a brutal but consistent system. Every item's value becomes a function of three factors: survival hours added, risk absorbed, and scarcity trajectory. Traditional wealth disappears. New wealth emerges from utility, danger, and knowledge. In the end, the rule of exchange becomes simple. Trade only when the transaction increases your lifespan more than it decreases your capability. Every deal is a life or death equation. The operational protocol begins with a single premise. Survival is not improvisation. Survival is preparation measured in calories, medicine, energy, information, and safety, secured before the collapse and protected after it. You do not adapt to chaos. You pre-engineer your position so when chaos arrives, you already control the variables that others are dying to acquire. The protocol is not philosophical. It is mechanical. If executed correctly, it converts a fragile civilian into a self-sustaining operator inside a failed economy. The first step is constructing the trade cache. This is not a hoard. It is a controlled inventory engineered for barter without compromising personal sustainability. The cache must contain divisible items, small units that trade cleanly without revealing total stock. Food should focus on calorie density, shelf life, and concealability. Medicine must include antiseptics, painkillers, antibiotics, bandages, and clotting tools, all protected from moisture and temperature swings. Energy assets must prioritize universal battery types, gas canisters, chargers, ignition sources, and compact stoves. Information tools require maps, radios, notes, printed skills, and any device capable of gathering or projecting intel. Safety items must include ammunition, spare parts, and limited defensive tools. Never the primary weapon system, only tradable redundancy. The second step is maintaining exchange credibility. Collapse destroys law but replaces it with something more predictable. Consequences. A survivor who deceives, steals, or reneges loses the ability to trade without force, and force burns resources exponentially faster than cooperation. Reputation becomes armor. Every completed transaction builds a buffer around you. People approach cautiously rather than violently because they calculate the risk of harming a reliable source. In this environment, predictability becomes a survival multiplier. The third step is terrain control. Never trade in exposed zones, never meet in unfamiliar territory, never walk into another group's ground without preparation. Strong points, basements, courtyards, alleys, rooftops become negotiation platforms because they reduce the angle of attack. When conditions allow, trade from a defensible perimeter with controlled entry points. Distance is protection. Cover is negotiation power. You do not trade with words, you trade with geometry. The fourth step is value calibration. Every trade must be measured by the survival hours equation. Does the transaction extend your life more than it reduces your future capability? A can of fuel for a flashlight battery may be worthless today, but critical during a night movement. A medical item may seem excessive until a wound reopens. Ammunition traded too cheaply becomes a death sentence 2 weeks later. The survivor must think in timelines, not emotions. What is abundant now becomes extinct later, and extinction is irreversible. The fifth step is concealment. Your advantage is secrecy. No one must know the depth of your stores, the range of your skills, or the scale of your network. Information about your capacity is more dangerous than any rival. People kill for resources they believe exist. They negotiate with resources they are unsure about. Concealment is not paranoia, it is economic infrastructure. The sixth step is force projection. Trade remains smooth only when the opposing party believes the cost of aggression outweighs the benefit. This requires visible deterrence, not threats, not theatrics, but posture and readiness. A survivor who looks unprepared invites violence. A survivor who demonstrates calm, disciplined control discourages it. Force projection is not about drawing weapons. It is about removing the attacker's confidence. The seventh step is diversification. A survivor who relies on a single category of goods becomes vulnerable. Food spoils, batteries drain, medicine expires, fuel diminishes, information becomes outdated, safety degrades with every exchange of ammunition. The only stable position is a rotating arsenal of capabilities that reinforce one another. Calories protect energy. Energy protects information. Information protects safety. Safety protects everything. The final step is identity transformation. The collapse economy does not reward the strongest or smartest, it rewards the most calculated. Civilians react emotionally. Operators react mechanically. Civilians hope systems return. Operators build systems that do not require return. The operational mindset converts scarcity into leverage, fear into caution, and uncertainty into advantage. When these protocols are executed as a unified system, the survivor is no longer trading to survive. They are trading to control. And control is the closest thing to wealth when the world has none.